The scream tore through the cabin like a blade in fabric, and heads snapped toward row 12, where a little black girl curled into herself. As a man across the aisle surged up with a clenched fist, and the world of stale air, coffee, steam, and engine hum collapsed into a tight circle of fear around her. He did not think he moved, yet he was already in the aisle, and the man's arm hung caught in his grip, mid-swing, the tendons of the wrist trembling, the knuckles whitening as if pressed against stone, and the eyes of the man went wide at the calm voice that said, "Let your hand go now and breathe, because she is a child, and you are not going to touch her again." The former Navy SEAL stood steady in the narrow space, his feet planted the way. Years of deck rolls and drop zones had taught him to plant them, his hand folding the attacker's wrist into a harmless shape that allowed the rage to leak out of the man like air from a tire, slow and certain, while the flight attendant froze. With a tray halfway down the aisle, and the plastic cups rattled in a rhythm that matched the girl's shaking, he angled his body so the girl disappeared behind him, and he saw her small fingers gripping the armrest, a cartoon sticker half peeled on the plastic, a frayed rainbow bracelet around her wrist, a tiny constellation of fear shining in her eyes, and it hit him lower than the ribs. The memory of another child who had looked at him through smoke and dust years back on a street that never stopped ringing inside his skull, and he spoke again with a softness that felt like a promise. "You are safe. I am here, and no one will harm you." The man tried to yank free, and hissed a word that did not belong in any human mouth, and the cabin pulled in a breath that tasted of metal and shame, but the SEAL did not flare. He rotated the wrist. He guided the man back into his seat. He used the headrest as a quiet anchor. He placed the man's hand flat on the armrest, palm open, a gesture that looked almost like surrender, and he said, "Stay exactly like this, and listen to me, and we will get through this without more pain." Passengers raised phones like shields, some trembling, some thirsty for proof, and he turned his head just enough and said, "Put them down, for her dignity, for her right to be a child, and for your own humanity." And one by one, the screens lowered, and the lights faded, and the cabin felt a fraction warmer. The mother sat wedged against the window, breathing too fast, her voice snagging on the words she wanted to form, and he crouched to her level and asked for permission with his eyes and a nod, and then shifted to the girl, who still held the armrest as if it were the last piece of land in a flood, and he said, "Tell me your name, warrior." And she replied in a whisper that sounded like a thread pulled through cloth, and told him she was Ava, and that her grandma had given her the bracelet, and that she wanted to go home. He checked the red bloom on her cheek, careful not to touch the tender skin, and anger moved in him like a storm that refused to break until it could be used for shelter and not destruction. He slid a travel blanket from the overhead and held it in a little tent so no one else could stare, and he guided the mother to breathe with him, slow in, slow out, and the three of them made a quiet island in the aisle while the world watched them. Man under his hand muttered something that did not fit the shape of a simple outburst. His voice shook in a way that did not match his earlier swagger, and he said, "Check the pocket, please, for the love of God. Check it." And the SEAL felt the hair prick on his arms, because desperation has a different smell from guilt, and he reached to the seatback pocket and found a folded napkin crusted with a smear that looked like dried ketchup or something darker, and a line scrawled in cramped letters that said, "Not me. Look 3 rows back left, and do not let them see you read this." He kept his face neutral. He kept his voice even. He told the nearest attendant to bring an ice pack and a water bottle, and to keep the cockpit informed that a disturbance had been contained. He spoke with a calm that carried a gentle authority, and while he said all that, his eyes traced the cabin in soft sweeps, counting the little tells. He had learned to see without thinking, a tapping heel that never synced with the engine hum, a jacket worn too tight across the midsection, a pair of eyes that did not track motion, but calculated. Intro 15, left side. A man in an aisle seat sat to still, a kind of statue stillness that only happens when someone is waiting for a clock to reach a number. He wore a tourist hoodie branded with a city far from here, but the cuffs were ragged in a way that spoke of long use and not souvenir joy, and under the seat, the edge of a dark object did not look like a backpack but looked like something tucked with care, and then disguised with the half-fall of a blanket. SEAL felt the pattern press against his memory like a finger on a bruise, a whisper from another life, when a street market had stayed too quiet until it did not, and he weighed the possibilities in a breath he could not afford to waste. He could confront and risk panic and stampede, or he could use the soft tools of patience and observation and move like water around a rock until the rock no longer mattered. He eased the attacker's hand off the armrest and guided the wrist behind the seat in a hold that looked casual to outside eyes. He nodded to two passengers who had the weight and the will to help, and they slid into positions that would keep the man still without spectacle. And then he leaned close to the attacker and said, "What is 3 rows back?" And the man whispered a word that shook like a loose bolt and said diversion, and then another word that tasted like old copper and said delivery, and then he closed his eyes as if he had finally spoken the thing that had choked him. The SEAL traced the thread building in silence. He asked the mother in a hush whether anyone had spoken to them before boarding, anyone who tried to switch seats or offer help. That felt like pressure, and she nodded with a fear bright. As Ison said, a kind-looking gentleman had offered to take the aisle so the little one could rest, and had smiled too long at the girl's bracelet, and had said what a pretty pat man, and had moved away when the boarding agent called for final group. He turned that over slowly. The bracelet, the pattern, the too long smile, and a new memory surfaced from a briefing room. Years ago, a symbol used by a small cell that trafficked people not for money first, but for leverage and messaging, a twisted flag of power and pain. And he looked again at the bracelet, threads woven in a simple rainbow, and yet one knot at the clasp was not like the others. A knot he had seen used to hide tiny trackers smaller than a grain of rice, and suddenly the attack became a flare in a night sky, pulling every eye toward it, while something else moved in the dark. He breathed once and promised Ava in a whisper that felt like a vow, "You are brave, and I am with you, and we will get you home." And then he rose with the grace of someone who has learned to disappear in plain sight. He flowed down the aisle as if checking the overhead for space, as if stretching his legs, as if being nothing more than a polite traveler, while his focus narrowed to a single point. Beneath seat 15, he passed the still man in the hoodie and heard a rhythm that did not come from breath or engine, a faint tick-tuck inside the noise of the aircraft, and he felt the cabin tilt a fraction as the plane met a pocket of rough air and people exhaled together, and the sound hid the whisper of plastic against metal that came from under the seat. He crouched to retie a shoe that did not need tying, and his fingers touched the blanket, and the blanket felt heavier where it draped, and he slid it aside in a motion that belonged to a fidget, not a search, and he saw a rectangle wrapped in dark tape with a single red blink that pulsed like a tiny heartbeat, and for a second the air around him went thin and far, and then everything narrowed back into purpose. He rose, and the man in the hoodie finally turned his head, and the eyes that met his were flat and cold, and much too calm for any ordinary traveler, and the lips moved in the smallest of smiles, and a whisper shaped the CAL's full name, though he had not spoken it to anyone on this flight, and the voice said, "We have been expecting youth." Seatbelt chime sang its gentle song. The aisle lights brightened and dimmed, and somewhere near the back a child began to cry, and the SEAL felt the thrum of choice climb his spine as he weighed whether to alert the cockpit right now or keep this circle closed for another breath. And in that breath the man's hand moved toward the edge of the seat, as if to scratch an itch, and the red light under the blanket blinked twice in quick succession, like a wink from the dark, and the former operator understood that the fist that had struck a child was never the real blow, and that the real strike was waiting right here. He looked back to Ava and her mother, who held each other like a single soul split into two bodies, and he nodded once to let them know he had them. He turned forward again and laid his palm flat against the armrest of row 15, where the hoodie man watched him with that thin smile, and the device whispered its tiny pulse, and every story the SEAL had ever lived folded into this narrow aisle at 30,000 feet as he drew a steady breath and chose his next move, while the world perched on a needle of time waiting to see whether it would bend or break. The red light blinked again under the seat, and the rhythm of it burned into the Navy SEAL's senses as if it were pulsing in his own veins, and he knew time had compressed into something fragile where every heartbeat carried weight enough to shatter or save lives, and the cabin around him buzzed with a mix of confusion, fear, and the shallow hunger of those who wanted only to escape the moment rather than confront it. The man in the hoodie leaned back as if he were on vacation, stretching his arms with lazy ease, and his eyes did not leave the SEAL, and though his mouth shaped the outline of a smile, there was no warmth in it, only the cold stillness of someone who knew exactly what power lay hidden at his feet. The SEAL forced his own breath into steadiness because panic was a chain that strangled judgment, and his training had drilled into him that clarity was forged in the quiet center of chaos. So he bent again in a casual motion, his hand brushing his shoelace, then lingering as he whispered a command in his own head. Do not rush, do not reveal, act as though this is nothing more than an itch. Scratch the device. Under the seat was small, too small for anything improvised, and sloppy too. Precise for amateur hands, and the way the tape was wrapped tight around the core suggested discipline, experience, and purpose. And yet the red blink was not steady, it pulsed in a coded pattern that he recognized from long hours decoding signals in darkened rooms. It was a beacon, not a countdown, and that meant the true danger was not here alone but somewhere connected to this plane, and perhaps waiting for this exact moment. A ripple of thought ran through him fast as electricity. What if the man who struck Ava had been pushed into it? What if his violence had been planted as a flare to distract everyone? What if the napkin warning was genuine, not a trick, but a desperate attempt to redirect blame from himself toward the real threats? The CL let the questions swirl, but he anchored himself on one solid fact. The device was active, and someone on this plane was guiding it, or watching it, and the man in the hoodie was too calm to be anyone but the handler. He moved to stand tall, blocking the line of sight from most passengers, his frame shielding the blanket that covered the device, and he leaned over just enough to whisper low and sharp, "What do you want from these people?" The hoodie man's smile widened only a fraction, and he whispered back something that made the SEAL's stomach tighten. "We do not want them, we want her." And his eyes flicked past the SEAL toward Ava, the little girl who still clutched her rainbow bracelet, as though it were the last thread holding her world together. The SEAL's jaw tightened, but he forced his voice to remain low, even as rage clawed at his chest. "Why?" Hertha man shrugged, a gesture to casual, and said, "She wears the mark. You already know this. Do not pretend otherwise." The CAL thought of the knot in the bracelet, the strange familiarity of its design, and he realized the girl was never chosen at random. She was targeted long before this flight, long before she even buckled into a seat. She was a thread in a wider web, and the attackers were pulling her into ETH. Straightened, slowly aware of every eye on him, though most of the passengers only saw a tall man talking quietly to another traveler. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, and he willed it to stay that way as he pressed his palm against the seatback and whispered to the attendant, who had crept closer, "Bring me a plastic bag and tape." Now no questions. The attendant blinked confusion, but something in his voice made her nod and disappear. Toward the Galathar, SEAL turned his attention back to the device, and made a decision born of instinct and sharpened by years of survival. He could not dismantle it here, not in the open, not with the handler watching and waiting for him to slip. Instead he would contain it, mask it, and buy time until they landed, or until he could find the signal that controlled ETH. Crouched low again, slid his hand under the seat, and with a steady motion lifted the device just enough to feel its weight. It was lighter than he expected, which confirmed his suspicion. It was not a full explosive charge, but a transmitter, a lure, perhaps connected to something larger and deadlier outside the plane. The hoodie man leaned closer and whispered, "Careful, soldier. The sky is thinner than you think, and one wrong touch makes it vanish for all of us." The SEAL ignored him, cradled the device in the plastic bag the attendant handed over, sealed it with tape, and slid it into his backpack with a practiced ease that looked no different than stowing a water bottle. And then he zipped the bag tight, pressed it flat beneath his seat, and sat back as though nothing had shifted in the world. But everything had shifted, because now he knew the target was not random violence but deliberate selection. The girl, Ava, was central to this, and the device was a beacon drawing something closer. He returned to her row, crouched beside her once again, and spoke softly, so only she and her mother could hear. "Ava, tell me about the bracelet. Where did your grandma get it?" Ava's lips trembled, but she answered. Her grandma made it herself. She said it would keep me safe. She tied the last knot with a prayer, and told me never to take it off. The SEAL felt a cold certainty slide into him. This was no ordinary bracelet. It was a key, and someone had marked the girl long before today. Her grandmother, perhaps unknowingly, had bound her with something that groups like these had twisted into a signal. He looked into the mother's eyes and asked, "Did anyone ever come to your home? Did anyone ever ask about your daughter's bracelet?" And the mother's face paled as she nodded slowly. "A stranger came months ago, said he was selling handmade crafts. He asked to see what jewelry we owned, and when he saw the bracelet he smiled and left without another word." The SEAL felt the pieces lock into place. The attacker, the napkin, the device, the calm handler, all part of a net woven around this child, and the plane was simply the stage where the trap would spring. He stood again and whispered to the nearest attendant, I need discreet contact with the cockpit now. Tell them we may have a coordinated threat, and not to announce it over the intercom. Attendant vanished, and the SEAL paced the aisle softly scanning every row for more handlers. Any sign of coordination, and he caught the flick of an eye from the rear, a woman in a business suit typing on her phone, though no signal could reach this high, yet her fingers moved in bursts, too rhythmic, too intentional, and her gaze darted toward Ava, then down again. Another handler confirmed his suspicion. This was not a lone wolf operation, this was layered, a web of watchers, and he was now tangled in the center. He slid back toward the hoodie man, who now hummed under his breath a tune too steady to be random, and the SEAL recognized it as a code once used by insurgents to communicate timing through rhythm, and he bent low and said, "You made one mistake. You thought I came unprepared, but I never step on a plane without knowing how to end a war before it begins." The hoodie man smirked and whispered, "We know who you are. We chose this flight for you as much as for her. You cannot protect both yourself and the child, and when the choice comes, you will break like all of them." SEAL leaned back, and his expression stayed calm, but inside him a fire spread slow and deep, because he knew the fight was not about brute force. It was about time and secrets, and finding which piece of the web to cut before the entire net collapsed. The cockpit door opened a sliver, and an attendant motioned him forward, and as he stepped past the rows of wide eyes and clenched hands, he felt Ava's gaze follow him, a silent plea carved into the air, and he gave her a small nod, a promise that he was not leaving her. He was only preparing the ground inside the cockpit. The captain's face was pale, his hands steady on the controls, and he listened as the SEAL explained quickly about the device, the handlers, the girl's bracelet, the pattern, and the captain asked the one question that mattered: "Can we land safely?" The SEAL weighed his words before answering. "If we descend now and declare emergency, they may trigger whatever backup they have. If we keep altitude and act calm, we buy time, but either way they will try to take her before we reach Hertha." Co-pilot spoke up, voice tight, "Then we need to know what they want with Hertha." SEAL nodded and said, "Exactly, and that is why I need access to the manifest. Give me the names, give me the seating chart, give me every inconsistency, and I will find out who arranged this." The captain handed over the data, and the SEAL scanned fast, his eyes catching anomalies: passengers booked last minute without checked baggage, names with mismatched origins. One stood out: the hoodie man's ticket purchased by a travel agency in a city far from his claimed destination, and another passenger, the businesswoman, her ticket linked to the same agency. The web thickened, and the SEAL knew it spread wider than this plane, but he had no luxury for the bigger picture. He needed only to protect Ava and dismantle the immediate threat. He left the cockpit, returned to the cabin, and met Ava's gaze again. But this time her mother whispered something that made his chest tighten. She said, "Ava said the man in the hoodie called her by name before you came to help, and now she asks how he knows who she is." The SEAL looked back at the hoodie man, whose smile had not broken once, and understood. The war was not waiting outside the plane, it was already here. Red light in his backpack blinked once, then twice, then 3 times, in a new rhythm he had never seen before, and the cabin lights flickered at the same moment, as though the pulse of the device had reached into the veins of the aircraft itself. And he knew part 2 of this story was no longer about controlling one man in an aisle. It was about fighting an entire plan that had chosen him as its unwilling piece and chosen Ava as its prize. The girl sat trembling, but her bracelet shone faint in the dim cabin glow, like a thread of color defying the dark, and the SEAL swore silently this would not end with her stolen from the sky. Hoodie man whispered again, soft enough only for him to hear, "It begins when the light stops, and soldier, you will have to decide which life to sacrifice. Because no one leaves this flight whole." And the red blink froze for a single long second, as the cabin held its breath, and the cliff edge the cabin felt suspended in silence as the red light held steady inside the SEAL's backpack, and it was as if every breath in the pressurized air had frozen, waiting for the verdict of that single blink. And in that breath the SEAL understood that this was no ordinary signal. This was the beginning of the real game, the one designed to test how far he could be pushed before something or someone broke. The hoodie man leaned forward, now his arms draped loosely across the tray table, his eyes unblinking, his voice calm enough to feel wrong as he said, "You know what that light means, don't you? It means the choice has been handed to you. You can bring her to us and land safely, or you can resist and watch the sky burn around youth." SEAL felt his jaw clench, but his face betrayed nothing. He had lived too long in places where a flicker of fear gave enemies their advantage, and so his expression stayed like water, still enough to hide the current. But inside his mind, the current roared as he calculated options, and every option came back to the girl too. Ava, to the rainbow bracelet, tied with a knot that was never meant for her small wrist. He rose slowly, letting his movements look casual, as if he were only stretching, as if he were only shaking off stiffness from the long flight, and he walked back toward Ava and her mother, who both looked up at him with eyes that carried questions they were too afraid to ask. He crouched low, his body shielding them from the rest of the cabin, and spoke in a voice that was no louder than a breath. "Listen to me. I will not let them take you, but I need you to do exactly as I say. Do you understand?" Ava nodded, small and sharp, her fingers still locked around the bracelet, and her mother clutched her hand tighter, as if she feared letting go would make her vanish, and the seal continued. "I need you to trust me. I will find the truth about this bracelet and why they want it, but until then, you must not react. No matter what happens, no matter what you hear, you stay still with me. Do you promise?" Ava's lips trembled, but she whispered, "I promise," and the seal felt the weight of her vow settle onto his shoulders, heavier than the pack on his back, heavier than all the missions before, because here was no platoon, no extraction, no backup. This was a child and a mother and a sky that could turn into fire at any moment. He stood again, his eyes scanning the cabin for allies, anyone who could help if things turned violent. He saw the man who had tried to strike Ava earlier, still pinned by 2 quiet passengers under his watch. But now, the man's eyes carried no hatred, only dread, as though he too had become a pawn forced into a role he never chose, and the seal recognized that fear. It was the fear of a man who had been threatened with something greater than his own life. He leaned closer to the restrained man and whispered, "What did they promise you, or what did they threaten?" And the man's lips cracked into a whisper. "They said my boy would die. If I didn't, they said she was the mark, not me. I never wanted to hit her. They forced me," and his eyes filled with tears that cut through the rough lines of his face. The sea, pressed his shoulder firmly and said, "Your boy will live if you keep quiet and help me. Now tell me everything you know." And the man shuddered but obeyed. He spoke of men who came to his house weeks ago, faceless in shadows, who showed him a picture of Ava, though he did not know her, and told him to play the role of the aggressor when the time came, that his anger would be the smokescreen to hide the true fire. The seal absorbed every word, and it matched what his instincts had screamed. The attackers wanted Ava not harmed but isolated. They wanted chaos around her so they could move unseen, and his anger thickened into iron resolve, because these men were not just terrorists, they were predators who hunted children. He straightened again and made his way toward the businesswoman near the back, still tapping her phone in coded bursts, though no signal could reach the ground, and he slid into the seat beside her with the disarming smile of a fellow traveler. Making small talk, she stiffened, only slightly, but enough for him to catch the tremor in her rhythm. He leaned close and whispered, "Stop pretending and tell me who you answer to." Her eyes snapped to him, sharp and cold, and she whispered back, lower than a hum, "We answer to the same master's soldier, you just don't know it yet." And her fingers stilled, as though waiting for his reaction, but he gave none, only silence. And then she said, "If you fight us, you put everyone here in the ground. If you give us the girl, no one else suffers." The seal stared at her long enough for the silence to sink deep into her confidence, and then he said, "You made a mistake thinking I would ever hand over a child," and her face twitched the smallest crack in her mask. He rose again, leaving her to her stillness, but his eyes had caught the truth. In her words, there were more layers to this trap than even he had guessed, and it was not only about Ava, it was about him too. They had chosen this flight because of him. They had chosen this moment because they believed he would break. As he moved back toward his seat, the captain's voice whispered through the intercom, in a tone designed not to alarm passengers but to reach him directly through coded phrasing. "Passengers, please remain calm as we adjust our course. We have a minor technical situation under review." And the seal knew that meant the cockpit had detected the same pulse. He had felt through the aircraft's veins, and they were buying him minutes, not hours. He slipped into his seat once more and unzipped his backpack just enough to see the device, its light no longer blinking, but glowing steady like an eye that had decided to stay open forever. And in that glow, he saw his reflection split across the plastic bag, and he whispered to himself, "Not today, not on my watch." Va shifted in her seat behind him, and he heard her voice, small but clear through the rush of air. She said, "Mr. Soldier, will we be safe?" And he turned enough to catch her eyes and answered, "Yes, we will, because I will not let anyone take you." But as he said the words, the hoodie man laughed softly, and said, "You can't protect her from everything, not even from the truth about who she really is." And the seal turned sharply, his eyes narrowing, because the man's tone carried certainty, "Not bluff who she is," he repeated, and the hoodie man leaned closer until his whisper was a hiss. "She is not just a child, she is a symbol. Her bloodline is marked, and her bracelet is only the signpost. You know it, or you would not have recognized the knot. You were meant to be here, soldier, meant to carry her through this, the seal's mind whirled back to missions long buried, to whispers of families marked by secret lineages, to rumors of children used as keys to codes older than wars. And for a flicker he wondered if this could be true, and if it was, then Ava was not only a target, she was a weapon, or a doorway to something larger. He steadied himself again, because speculation was a poison, and only facts kept people alive, and the fact was simple. The handlers wanted Ava alive. The device was a beacon, the girl was the prize, and he was the shield, standing between them. He rose one more time, walked to Ava's row, and gently placed his hand on the seatback beside her. He looked at her mother and said, "Hold her close, no matter what happens. Do not let her out of your arms." And then he looked down the aisle at the hoodie man, whose smile had finally begun to fade. Seal drew a breath and projected his voice, just enough for the nearby rows to hear. "If anyone here values their life, listen to me. We are in danger, but we will survive only if we stay calm and stay together." And though fear flickered through the passengers, a current of trust followed, because his voice carried the weight of truth. The hoodie man shook his head and muttered, "You still don't see. You're not fighting us, you're fighting fate." And then his hand brushed against something beneath his hoodie, and the seal tensed, ready to strike, but stopped as the man only pulled out a folded photograph and slid it onto the trailer. Seal reached for it, cautiously unfolded it, and froze, because staring back at him was a younger Ava, barely a toddler, sitting on the lap of someone he recognized, someone from his past, a comrade long dead, who had fallen in a mission years ago, and the shock of it rattled the very core of his certainty. The hoodie man whispered, "Fate, soldier, she was chosen long before today." The cabin lights flickered once more, the device in his bag pulsed again, and the seal understood that the truth was deeper than a single attack. It was a chain stretching back through years of shadows and blood, and now it had reached him again at 30,000 feet with a child whose bracelet glowed with the weight of generations. He tightened his grip on the photograph, slid it into his pocket, and turned back to Ava and her mother, his voice steady though inside the storm raged. "You were not alone, not anymore." And then he looked forward, knowing that the next move would either save them or end them, because the enemy was no longer only in the aisle or under the seat. The enemy was in the past, and in the bloodline of the girl he had sworn to protect. And as the plane shuddered with the turbulence of both storm and fate, he whispered to himself, "The battle begins now, and this time there will be no surrender." Plane rattled with turbulence, but the true shaking was inside the cabin, where fear grew thick as smoke, and the seal stood in the narrow aisle, clutching the photograph tighter than he meant to his knuckles, white against the faded paper, and his mind burned with questions that refused to sit quietly, because the face in the photo was not just anyone. It was a friend, a brother in arms, a man he had carried home under a flag years ago, and yet there he was, holding baby Ava as if she were his own blood. He turned toward the hoodie man, whose calm mask finally cracked with a hint of satisfaction, as if revealing that one bitch had been his weapon all along. And the seal stepped closer, voice low but sharp. "How do you have this photo? Who gave it to you?" The hoodie man's smirk deepened. "Not all battles are fought with guns, soldier. Some are fought with truths. You tried to bury the blood you lost is the same blood that runs through her. You think you are protecting a stranger, but you are shielding your own." The words struck harder than the turbulence, and for a moment the seal's breath faltered. He wanted to deny it, but the storm inside him knew better. His friend, who died in fire and dust, had left more behind than memories. He had left a child, a secret bloodline, and fate had carried her into this very plane. He'd steadied himself, refusing to let shock paralyze him. He had no room for it, not here, not now. He leaned close, his voice quiet but heavy with resolve. "You think family ties will make me weak. You're wrong, they make me unbreakable." The hoodie man tilted his head, almost curious, and said, "We will see, because she was never meant to be hidden. She is a signal, and those who marked her will not stop until she is theirs. You can fight me, soldier, but you cannot fight destiny." The seal turned from him and walked back to Ava and her mother, who clutched the child against her chest, as though she feared the walls of the plane itself would open and swallow her. He crouched, beside them again, and whispered, "I need you to listen carefully, Ava. You are brave beyond your years, and nothing they say can change the truth that you are still just a child, and you deserve to live free. I will not let them take you, not now, not ever." Her mother's eyes searched his face, desperate for answers. What is happening? Why are they after her? What do they mean she was chosen? And the seal exhaled, slow, steady, because the truth was heavy, but silence would be worse. "I knew your daughter's father long ago. He was a man who gave his life in battle, and somewhere in that battle, secrets were kept from you, from me, from all of us. Now, those secrets have surfaced, and they are using them to twist fate. But listen to me, fate is not stronger than will, and will is what I have." The mother trembled, but nodded, and Ava whispered, "You knew my father," and the CL's voice broke softer than he meant to. "Yes, Ava, I knew him, and he was a good man, and he would want you safe." The plane lurched again, and murmurs swept through the cabin as fear spread in waves. The businesswoman near the back still tapped her silent code, though slower now, as if she too felt pressure closing in. The restrained man wept quietly for his son, and the hoodie man waited, calm as stone. The seal knew he had to act. Before control slipped completely, he rose and addressed the passengers in a voice that carried steady over the roar of engines. "I will not lie to you, there is danger here, but panic is our greatest enemy. We will land soon, and you will survive. If you remain calm, you will trust me, because I know how to end this." Their eyes fixed on him, some desperate, some doubtful, but his presence gave them something they could cling to in the storm, and slowly the whisper's dimmed eye turned his focus inward to the device sealed in his backpack, glowing like a captive heartbeat. He could not dismantle it here, not without risking everything, but he could feel its signal throbbing, reaching beyond the walls of the aircraft, and he realized it was not only a beacon, it was a tether connecting Ava to something waiting beyond the clouds. He thought fast, scanning through memories of missions where codes were broken, where signals were jammed, and then he remembered one technique, crude but effective, using feedback to overload a transmitter, forcing it to blind itself. He needed access to the aircraft's comm system or something strong enough to jam the frequency. He stepped toward the cockpit again, but before he reached it, the businesswoman rose from her seat, her phone still in hand, and her voice clear and sharp for the first time. She said, "You will doom us all if you try to resist. We have orders to deliver the girl, and if you fight that order, everyone here dies." The cabin gasped as her mask fell, and the seal locked eyes with her, his voice hard. "You reveal yourself now, because you know your clock is running out. You know your masters are watching, and you want me to bend, but listen carefully, I do not bend, I break chains, and yours is next." She flinched for the first time, her calm veneer cracking, and she shouted to the hoodie man, "We cannot hold longer, trigger it now." And the hoodie man shook his head, smiling. "Let him struggle a little more." The seal lunged, then moving with speed honed by years of survival, his hand clamping the businesswoman's wrist, twisting the phone free before she could resist, and he smashed it against the armrest, shattering plastic and glass, scattering the pieces into the aisle. Her cry, sharp and furious, but powerless, he spoke over her voice to the passengers. "No one moves, no one listens to their threats." And then he looked directly at Ava and said, "Hold on, we are almost there." The captain's voice broke through, again coded but urgent. "Prepare for descent, hold steady, 30 minutes to ground." And the seal felt both relief and tension. 30 minutes was both salvation and eternity, and in that span the enemy would not wait quietly. He dragged the businesswoman toward the restrained attacker, seat-belted her down beside him, and whispered, "If you try to rise again, you will not walk away from it." And she glared but said nothing. The hoodie man watched, amused, almost entertained, as if the whole struggle were only theater, and whispered across the aisle, "You fight so hard, soldier, but every move you make only proves how much she matters. You know it now. She is your blood." The seal ignored him, though the truth gnawed inside his chest. He focused instead on the rhythm of the device still glowing in his bag. He leaned into the cockpit, whispered fast to the captain, "Patch me into the comm line. Now give me control of the signal." The captain's face tightened, but he obeyed, opening the panel and feeding a line to the seal, who pulled a small adapter from his own pocket, always carried for emergencies, and patched it into the system. The static roared, and the pulse of the device throbbed louder through his ears. He closed his eyes, forcing focus as he shifted frequencies, building interference, layering signal upon signal until the pulse stuttered, until the glow dimmed, flickered, then flared again, fighting him. But he pressed harder, sweat running down his back as he forced the transmitter into feedback until finally the steady light wavered and blinked erratic, confused, blinded by its own echo. He yanked the line free, sealed the system, and sat back, his breath ragged, but his eyes hard. The tether is cut. They cannot track her, not now. The hoodie man's smile finally slipped his calm, breaking into a snarl. You think you've won, soldier. You think blinding us will stop what is already written. The seal stepped close, his voice low enough that only the man could hear. Nothing is written, except what we carve, and I carve survival. And he pressed the man back into his seat with a strength that ended the conversation. He returned once more to Ava and her mother, kneeling again, his voice gentle. I broke the chain, for now they cannot see you, but they will try again when we land. So you must stay strong. You must trust me until the ground is under us. Do you understand? Ava nodded, her small face set with courage beyond her years, and her mother whispered, thank you, and tears slipped down her cheeks. The seal placed his hand lightly on Ava's bracelet, not to remove it, but to honor it, and said, your father would be proud of you. Ava, he gave everything so you could live free, and I will not let his sacrifice be stolen. The engines roared louder as the descent began, and the cabin tilted, sending a ripple of unease through the passengers. But their eyes clung to the seal as if he were the anchor, holding them steady. Yet inside his chest he knew the battle was not done. The web was larger than this plane, and cutting one tether would not end the hunt. The moment they landed, another storm would reascend. As the clouds parted below and the faint glow of city lights appeared like stars fallen to earth, he whispered to himself, Part 4 is survival, but Part 5 will be war, because the enemy will not let go until every truth is dragged into the light. The nose of the plane dipped gently as the descent deepened, but inside the cabin there was nothing gentle. Every passenger sat braced against invisible weight, every eye tracking the man who had become their shield, their judge, and their only thread of hope. And the seal knew this final stretch would decide everything, because the handlers would never allow the girl to reach the ground. Alive and free, he crouched again at Ava's row, the little girl's fingers locked so tight around her mother's that the blood drained from her knuckles, and he spoke soft but firm. Ava, listen to me. You have already faced more than most adults ever will. You are strong, you are brave. But now I need you to do one more thing. When we land, do not let go of me or your mother, no matter what happens. Do you understand? Ava nodded and whispered, I will not let go, I promise. And the words felt like a vow carved into the air, and the seal pressed his palm to her small hand as if sealing oath, rose and swept the cabin with his eyes. The businesswoman sat seething, strapped down, her wrists bruised from struggling. The restrained man wept quietly for his son, guilt carving deep lines in his face. And the hoodie man leaned back as though relaxed, but his eyes glittered like blades in low light, and the seal knew he was waiting, not for rescue but for chaos. The plane shuddered as it pushed through heavy cloud layers, and in that rumble he heard the hoodie man whisper, almost to himself, they are already here, waiting on the ground, and you will walk right into their hands, because that is the only way this ends. The seal leaned close, his words cold. Not if I turn the ending upside down, not if I rewrite it with fire. He moved quickly toward the cockpit again, ducking into the narrow space, and the captain glanced back, sweat glistening on his temple as he said, ground control reports no abnormalities. But his tone betrayed doubt, and the seal leaned close, speaking low, you need to prepare for a hostile reception when we land. I want emergency vehicles positioned near the runway. I want no jet bridges. I want stairs only, and police presence, real police, not Dickwister. Captain nodded, but his eyes flicked, uncertain. How do we know who is real? And the seal answered, we don't, but I will know when I see them. He left the cockpit and steadied himself in the aisle, and spoke to the passengers again. Listen to me when we land. Stay in your seats. Do not rush the aisle. Do not follow orders unless they come from me or the flight crew. These people will try to use panic against us, but we will not give it to them. The passengers nodded, some wide-eyed, some grim, but all clung to his words as if they were lifelines. The hoodie man chuckled low and muttered, you think you can hold back a tide with your hands? Soldier, you forget tides drown everyone eventually. And the seal turned sharply, his voice like a blade. No tide ever scared a man who has already walked through fire. The engines roared louder, the descent pulling their stomachs tight, and Ava's mother clutched her daughter as if to shield her from the gravity itself. The seal slid back into the seat beside them, one hand still near his pack, where the blinded device lay dormant, but he knew it was not destroyed, only muted, and at any moment its masters might find another way to wake it The landing gear thumped into place, a heavy reminder that ground was near, and with it the next battle. The Seal's body tensed with readiness, every nerve sharp, every breath measured. He whispered to himself, 30 seconds to dirt, 30 seconds to war. The plane touched down hard tires, screeching against the runway, sparks of friction like brief stars outside. The window, the cabin jolted with cries and gasps, and then steadied as the aircraft barreled down the asphalt, slowing, grinding, fighting inertia, until it rolled slower, and finally coasted into silencer. Passengers exhaled as one, but the Seal did not relax. His eyes locked on the windows where emergency lights glowed, red and blue flashing against the night, and figures moved in uniforms near the tarmac. But uniforms could be masks, and masks had already filled this flight. The captain's voice came steady into the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we have landed. Remain seated until instructed. But beneath his calm words, the Seal heard the tremor of uncertainty. The stairs rolled toward the door, guided by ground crew, and the Seal stood already positioning himself between Ava and the exit. He whispered to her mother, "Stay behind me no matter what happens," and then he locked eyes with the hoodie man, who now smiled wide, as if welcoming the final act. The door hissed open, cool night air rushing in, mixing with the stale cabin air, and the first figures boarded uniforms. Crisp badges, flashing guns holstered. They looked every bit like airport security, but the Seal's eyes caught the details. One badge tilted at the wrong angle, one holster strapped too high, one man's boots, military grade, not regulation issue, stepped forward, blocking their path. His voice firm, "Identify your commanding officer now," and the leader flashed a badge saying Federal Task Force, and ordered, "Step aside, soldier." But the Seal's instincts screamed louder than the engines ever had. This was not right. He barked back, "Passengers, stay seated," and when one of the men reached for his weapon, the Seal struck first, his fist snapping into the man's wrist, twisting the gun free before it cleared leather. The cabin erupted with screams, but the Seal's voice cut through everyone. Down now, and his presence froze the imposters long enough for real ground security to rush forward behind them, weapons drawn, voices booming, drop them, and the tarmac erupted into chaos. The fired first shots cracking like thunder through the narrow space glass, shattering panels, splintering passengers ducking under seats. The Seal dove low, dragging Ava and her mother flat, shielding them with his body, while returning fire with the stolen weapon. His shots precise, deliberate, one target down, another disarmed. The hoodie man surged up in the chaos, trying to break free, but the Seal spun, struck him hard across the jaw, and shoved him back into the seatbelt before he could reach Ava. The imposters fought fiercely, but they were outnumbered, real forces swarming in their formation, crumbling under the pressure, until one by one they fell, restrained or unconscious. The gunfire fading into echoes against the steel of the fuselage fell, broken only by sobs and the hiss of leaking airlines, and the Seal rose slowly, pulling Ava and her mother up with him, his body shielding them, until the last imposter was dragged away. The real commander stepped forward, face stern, eyes sharp, and said, "You saved every soul on this flight, soldier. But who is the girl? Why would they risk so much for her?" And the SEA shook his head, his voice low, "Because she is more than they know, and more than we yet understand, and that truth is still coming." He led Ava and her mother down the stairs onto the tarmac, where lights painted the night in flashes of red and blue, and the air smelled of jet fuel and gunpowder. He crouched before Ava one last time, eyes steady on hers. "Ava, you are safe for now, but this fight is not finished. They will try again. They will not stop. But listen to me, you are not alone anymore. You have me." Ava wrapped her arms around his neck, small and fierce, and whispered, "I believe you," and the Seal felt the promise burn deep in his chest. He stood, turning back toward the wreckage of the plane where passengers slowly emerged, shaken but alive. His eyes caught the hoodie man being dragged away, still smiling through split lips, and the Sea knew that smile meant something larger than this battle had only begun. The commander approached again, asking, "What now, soldier?" And the Seal answered with the steel of certainty, "Now we take her to ground, where truth cannot hide, because this war is not about one flight. It is about every shadow that ever tried to take a child and call it destiny, and I will not let destiny win." As Ava clung to his hand, and her mother walked close, the night air roared with the noise of chaos and survival, and the Seal whispered to himself, "This was only part 5. The storm will break fully in part 6, and when it does, I will carve an ending no enemy can steal." The night air cut sharp against his skin as they moved across the tarmac, but the Seal felt no chill, only the pounding of his heart as he kept Ava and her mother close, and the chaos of the landing behind them echoed in sirens, shouts, and the dull clatter of weapons being secured. Yet through it all, the little girl's hand clung to his with the fierce strength of someone who refused to be lost. Again the commander guided them toward an armored vehicle parked at the edge of the runway, its engine humming like a beast waiting to run. But even as they moved, the CAL's eyes swept every shadow, every uniform, every face, because he knew the enemy was clever enough to wear masks and bold enough to slip into any crowd. Hoodie Man was dragged across the asphalt between two armed officers, his smile cracked but still fixed as though pain and defeat were irrelevant, and as he passed he hissed low enough for only the SEAL to hear, "This is not the end, soldier, you have only delayed the tide. She will be ours because she was born to be ours." The SEAL stopped only a second, meeting his eyes with the full weight of his resolve, and answered, "No, she was born to be free, and you will never touch her again." They reached the vehicle, and the commander opened the heavy door, urging them inside. But before stepping in, the SEAL turned his gaze on the commander. "One last test. What unit trained you?" And without hesitation, the commander answered the truth, a detail so small, yet known only to those who had lived the real fire, and the SEAL gave a short nod, satisfied. These were no imposters, these were allies. The armored vehicle, the hum muffled the world outside. Ava sat pressed against her mother, eyes wide but steady. The SEAL crouched to her level again, voice calm though his body still thrummed with battle. "Ava, you did everything I asked. You were brave, you kept your promise. Now I will keep mine. No one will take you from me." Her lips trembled as she whispered, "They said I was chosen. Is that true?" And he felt the weight of the question press deep into his chest. He could not lie to her, not after all this. He nodded slowly. "Yes, Ava, you were chosen, but not in the way they think. They believe you are a symbol. They want to turn you into a weapon, but you are more than that. You are proof that love and family survive even when the world tries to burn them away. You are your father's legacy, and that makes you precious beyond anything they can understand." Her mother's tears fell freely as she pulled her daughter close, and the SEAL looked away briefly because the ache of memory pulled at him hard. His friend, his brother in arms, the man he lost in a desert of dust and fire, now lived on through this child, and destiny had thrown her into his path, not for destruction but for protection. The vehicle rolled forward, lights flashing past as they left the runway behind, but the SEAL felt the tension in the air shift again, too soon for comfort. He looked out the slit of the window and saw headlights approaching fast from a side road, vehicles without markings, moving like wolves in formation. He slammed his hand against the partition. "Driver, we have company, reroute now," and the armored vehicle swerved hard as bullets sparked against its frame. Ava screamed, clinging tighter to her mother, and the SEAL drew, his weapon eyes narrowing into steel. The commander shouted from the front convoy, "Trying to cut us off. We need a safe house." But the SEAL knew there was no time for a long chase. The enemy had planned this. They had layers upon layers, and he had to cut straight through or risk losing Ava in the chaos. He braced himself as the vehicle swerved again, tires screaming against asphalt, and he barked to the commander, "Listen to me. You cannot protect her by running. You protect her by finishing this tonight." The commander's eyes caught his in the rearview mirror. "You mean strike back?" And the SEAL nodded firm. "Yes, we stop hiding. We end the hunt right here, right now." The convoy drew closer, shadows of men leaning from windows, rifles glinting in the night, and the SEAL pushed Ava and her mother lower, covering them with his body as rounds hammered against the armor. Then he shouted to the driver, "Cut across to the old service tunnel. It's narrow, they can't follow in formation." And the driver swerved violently, plunging down a side path toward the dark mouth of concrete. The enemy vehicles scrambled, some overshooting, some crashing into each other, and the armored vehicle roared into the tunnel, where the echoes of gunfire bounced like thunder. The SEAL pushed open the rear hatch, leaned out into the rushing wind, and fired back, each shot precise, each target chosen with lethal calm, until sparks burst from hoods and tires, shredded. One by one they burst out the far end of the tunnel into open fields, and the SEAL shouted, "Stop the vehicle now." The driver slammed the brakes hard, and the night fell into silence, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal. The SEAL leaped out, weapon drawn, scanning the horizon where the enemy vehicles burned or limped in the distance. He turned back to the commander and said, "They will not stop hunting her unless we cut the head from the snake. Tell me where they are. Tell me who runs this shelter." Commander hesitated, then spoke a name. one that carried the weight of betrayal, a name from the SEAL's past, a superior officer long retired. Or so it had seemed, a man who had commanded missions with ruthless precision and who now apparently led this shadow network. The SEAL's jaw tightened, the betrayal searing deeper than bullets ever could. He turned back to Ava and her mother, his voice steady. "We end this tonight. If I do not cut it off at the root, they will never stop coming." And her mother's eyes wide with fear asked, "How do you stop something this big?" And his answer was simple: by refusing to let fear write the ending. The commander arranged for extraction helicopters, lifting from the horizon, and in minutes, the air thundered with rotor blades. The SEAL lifted Ava into his arms, her bracelet catching the moonlight like a beacon, and she whispered, "Will we be safe now?" And he whispered back, "Yes, because I will not stop until the last shadow is gone." They boarded the helicopter, the night rushing below them, and the SEAL stared out at the burning wreckage fading in the distance, knowing this war was larger than one flight, larger than one mission, but also knowing that tonight he had carved a crack in their armor. As dawn bled into the horizon, Ava finally fell asleep in her mother's arms, exhaustion pulling her into peace, and the SEAL sat across from them, eyes never closing. Because vigilance was the price of protection, but inside him a softer truth grew. He had not only saved a child, he had found family again, in the most impossible place. The commander leaned close over the roar of the blades, asking, "What will you do when this is over?" And the SEAL's eyes stayed fixed on the sleeping child, his voice calm. "I will teach her that she is more than chosen, she is free, and I will make sure the world never takes that from her." The helicopter banked toward safety, and the SEAL finally allowed himself a long breath, not relief, but resolve, because he knew the battle would come again, the shadows would rise again, but now he was not just a soldier, he was a guardian, and that gave him more strength than any war had ever given us. The first rays of sun struck the bracelet on Ava's wrist, lighting it like fire. The SEAL whispered to himself, "Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find who you really are." And in that moment he knew he had found himself not in the fire of combat, but in the fragile hand of a child who trusted him completely. The story closed, not with defeat, not with surrender, but with transformation. A man who had once lived only for war, now lived for something greater, and the lesson carved deep into the silence of dawn was this: destiny is not written, it is chosen. And tonight they had chosen freedom over fear, and so the tale of the flight ended fully, not in tragedy but in survival, not in despair but in renewal. The passengers alive, the child safe, the mother strong, and the soldier reborn as guardian and protector. A story closed in full circle, so the world could know that even in the darkest sky, one man's choice could turn fate itself into light. The end.